Okay, we're going to try to finish up chapter 8 here on fixed assets and depreciation. And the last couple things we're going to talk about are natural resources. Natural resources defined as something that's physically consumed. In other words, it can be wasted assets. And this is normally involving things like lumber. If you're a company like Weyerhaeuser up in the Pacific Northwest, they do lumber and they cut down trees and turn them into inventory. If you're if you're a mineral company, you might be mining things out in Nevada or in Africa or all over the world for that matter. And if you're an oil company, you're typically pumping oil or maybe natural gas. And so these things are all called consumable assets, and they are converted to inventory. So you've got raw materials converted into products. Okay. What must happen here is you have to take an expense as a natural resource asset as it is depleted. Notice that sounds a lot like depreciated, but it's depleted. The expense must be taken in the period in which it is consumed or harvested, would be the word some use. Okay, so natural resource assets, they are depleted, so this is going to be a depletion expense. All right, here's what it looks like. All right, suppose Exxon buys land with a deposit of 500,000 barrels of crude oil. They paid $1.5 million for the land and pumped 15,000 barrels during this accounting period. First of all, find the depletion per unit. It's very much like units of production. Here's your $1.5 million divided by 500,000 barrels. Notice that that is a big, round, rough estimate. There's no way they know how many barrels of oil are in a deposit like that. So they take an estimate. Again, here is where accounting seems black and white when you just look at the numbers and the debits and the credits, but it's very, very gray. This estimate is a crude estimate, no pun intended, with crude oil. But anyway, come out with $3 a barrel if you do the math here, and the depletion expense then is this dollars per barrel or dollars per unit, whatever it is, times the number of units here that they pumped during that accounting period. So 15,000 barrels times $3 a barrel gives you 45,000. Here's what your debit looks like. Depletion expense, very much like depreciation expense. And here we call it accumulated depletion. So very, very similar. You just replace the word depreciation with the word depletion because you depleted it. Okay. What's the net book value of the oil deposit after this year? Well, 1.5 million minus the accumulated depletion. So 1,455,000. That is the 1.5 minus the 45. Pretty simple. Okay. Intangible assets. We've got to talk about things that can be amortized over the cost of the asset. And there are a lot of assets that it's hard to touch. It's hard to comprehend. They're hard to even visualize for some folks, but they're real. Okay. If you had a patent, this is a huge thing in software licensing right now. And also there was a gigantic lawsuit in America that was pronounced in favor of Apple, a $1 billion lawsuit against Samsung, the biggest maker of cell phones in the world, because their phones looked like iPhones. So this is a big, big deal. Okay, if you are a songwriter or an author, copyrights are huge. If somebody copies your work or takes your song and duplicates it or wants to just use it for making money for themselves, they owe you a royalty. So copyrights are huge. Trademarks, we'll talk about brand equity and how trademarks, little things like the golden arches, that little BMW symbol, all of these things, the Nike swoosh, these are all trademarks that are worth money. And if you try to do knockoffs, or if you see knockoffs being purchased without that money going back to the company, there's a huge violation of trademark law. Goodwill is something we'll talk about. Leaseholds, if you own the lease to a property, even though the property sells, that lease may still be active. So leaseholds are actually a tremendous asset in the real estate market. Okay, so similar to fixed asset accounting, we amortize intangibles instead of depreciate them. So we've learned three words now: depreciate, deplete, and now amortize. Okay, if you have a patent, this is typically an exclusive right to make and sell an item or use a process. These typically last for 17 to 20 years. They can be bought, sold, or traded. And these deadlines or these durations of patents often do change depending on what it is and what country you're in. So a lot of variation there. What would happen here if a company purchases a patent for $25,000 and it's going to be good for 10 years? What journal entry is made at the end of year one? Well, you would just simply go 25,000 divided by 10. It's worth 2,500. So there you go. Notice here you would do amortization expense and then accumulate amortization in the way of patents here, just like depreciation. Okay. Little note there is that if a company has R&D costs leading up to patents, you've got to spread those costs out in the period in which these things occurred. Whether or not your R&D is going to lead to a marketable product is hard to predict, especially in, say, drug companies or even in high tech. You don't know if that chip you're going to make or if that phone you're going to make is actually going to be sellable. So it's hard to predict what these things are, but you're supposed to track those R&D costs and attribute them to the accounting period in which they occurred. So copyrights, right to publish, sell music or literature, we know what these are. These typically extend up to 70 years beyond the death of the creator. After that, they become public domain. So the song Happy Birthday, it's been around forever. Nobody makes a royalty off of that. That's public domain. Okay, the Beatles catalog was sold to Michael Jackson, and then they bought it back, or Paul McCartney bought it back. Huge money in those royalties. Okay, so big money if they're famous books or famous songs. Trademarks, we know all about this, right? This can be music, even a little 4-note jingle. It can be a phrase. McDonald's has coined the phrase, I'm loving it. All right, Nike swoosh, we talked about that, and the Coca-Cola swirl. These are very common trademarks that are known around the world. All right, leaseholds. If you have a right to use a property and you've got a lease, all right, that can be worth a lot of money. Okay, if you have a long-term lease like the British did for Hong Kong for 99 years, that was worth a lot of money. And when that lease was finally up, the Chinese were never going to renew that lease. So anyway, Britain had a lease on Hong Kong for 99 years. So anyone who thinks leaseholds aren't worth anything, they're sorely mistaken. Goodwill is kind of an interesting concept. Goodwill is money you pay above and beyond the book value of a company. So it's intangible value based on the reputation or brand equity, good team, skilled workforce. It could be a lot of things. My best example of goodwill would be if you were to start a burger stand called Dave's Burger Stand, and you had nice French fries and good burgers and good prices. Everything you had was exactly the same as this little burger stand across the street from you that had golden arches and a Ronald McDonald character and a Big Mac and all that. If your food was just the same as theirs, yet you were selling your businesses, the McDonald's business would very likely get a huge bump in purchasing price just because of their brand equity, their reputation, the global advertising. Even if your product was the same, your profits were the same, your prices were the same, your costs were the same, somebody would pay more for McDonald's, and that amount they would pay above the value, the book value of their business would be called goodwill. So goodwill used to be, well, here's what it means. The buyer pays a premium over the fair market value for extra value of that company or of that asset. What goodwill means is you used to be able to amortize it, not anymore. Okay, so we don't do that anymore, but you should understand what goodwill is. Here's an example. Microsoft bought a company for 18 million. The company's market value is 10. We used to be able to amortize this 8 million of goodwill over 40 years. You won't have to. All right. The rule changed about 10 years ago because companies were having so much goodwill, they're getting a huge write-off on their books. This is a real number from a real purchase. Procter & Gamble bought Revlon's Max Factor cosmetic line, not the whole Revlon company, just this line. And the question is, does the name brand have value above and beyond its normal value, its book value? The answer is yes. Microsoft paid, or I'm sorry, Procter & Gamble paid 1.025 billion or 1,025 million, and over 90% of it was what they called goodwill. So what that means is the Max Factor cosmetic line was worth about 100 million. They paid 927 million over that. And so they paid almost $1 billion of goodwill in excess of the purchase price or the book value of the Max Factor cosmetic line. So that's how intangible assets work. If you don't think that these things have value, here's a look at some of the world's most valuable brands. This was in 2010. Notice 4 of the top 5 are tech companies. Got a few more tech companies down here. GE makes everything, right? Intel, Nokia. Nokia may not have that many phones in America, but they are very popular in Europe and especially in Scandinavia. Look at the latest ones here. Just pulled this up off the website tonight. Okay, Apple's still number 1. IBM's bumped up. Google's bumped up. Okay, who was in the top 10? I forgot who that was. Coca-Cola has dropped out of the top 10. McDonald's has moved in the top 5. Still got Microsoft there. Oh no, there's Coca-Cola. They just fell out of the top 5. Marlboro. Now what's missing here was Intel and GE, and who else? Intel, GE, Nokia have fallen out and replaced by all three phone companies, or actually broadband companies, companies that give cell phone networks. Okay, so look at the value. $183 billion is what they say the Apple brand is worth. All right, over here, just 2 years ago, it was only worth 57 billion. So these numbers are rising dramatically because these companies put so much money into advertising. It's that brand that just had crazy people lining up, hundreds of them, at 4 a.m. to go get the new iPhone 5. Samsung has an interesting ad campaign against the iPhone 5, but anyway, Apple clearly is able to charge so much money for their phones and is able to get people to line up in stores because people value this brand, whether it's real or perceived, and that brand has a true value for the company. Okay, you've got an exam coming up. Hope you guys do well with that, and that is the last lecture of Chapter 8.